Hello and welcome to News in Depth here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Ahead of the informal gathering of European leaders on Thursday, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and Finance Minister Andrzej Domanski unveiled a new initiative, the Council of the Future. At the same time, President Emmanuel Macron urged Europe to finally act like a global power. Are these signs of a broader European realignment towards real autonomy from the United States? Well, joining me now is Jakub Kapiszewski, he's business editor at TVP World, to unpack what all this really means. Jakub, welcome and thanks for taking the time.
Hello, sir.
Hello, sir. So before we kick off, as usual, we have a short soundbite. I'd like to watch that and get your view on it.
We need to constantly look for new engines of growth, and this is why Prime Minister decided to create this council that consists of people from AI, data, space technologies, but also biotech, the areas of economy where we see the biggest potential for Poland, for Polish economy. And it's not a coincidence that those people will have kind of right to advise to the government, to the Prime Minister, as the council consists of the people who already achieved success, for example, in business. We need to improve the transfer of knowledge from universities to business. We have asset, the human capital asset here in Poland, and we need to build on that. We have great companies that, for example, in the space field, in dual use, of course in IT sector, we'd like to also use their experience to build a future of Polish economy.
So, Council of the Future sounds great, and what we just heard was pretty impressive. What is happening, I mean, strategically speaking, and why now?
Well, I think the government is just looking for some insights from people who are not directly linked to any form of government or a local authority. This is why you have a Polish astronaut on this Council of the Future. This is why you have a biotech executive on this council. This is why you have a guy from an AI company on this council. So the government is apparently trying to find as much relevant expertise outside of government, trying to just bring it in with some fresh ideas and fresh looks.
Okay, fresh ideas, fresh looks, makes perfect sense. But at the end of the day, it has to be implemented by the government, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So how can we be sure, or what are they planning on doing to get those ideas translated into action by the government?
Exactly. Those councils are only as good as the implementation of the ideas they will form or send to the government. Well, we actually had some successes in this area because just 1 year ago, Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, announced creation of another special body, advisory body, that was devoted to deregulation. And it has been headed by a famous Polish businessman, Rafał Brzoska, a guy who made money in a parcel business. And he took advisors from all over many fields like taxes, administrative procedures, e-government, and so on. And those guys compiled a list of postulates and they sent them to the government, and the government actually implemented many of those ideas, but only because the business side of this equation was working very strictly with a dedicated team on a government side. So you have people forging ideas, and you had people translating those ideas into concrete legislative proposals. And only with this strong political backing has any advisory body does any advisory body make any sense? Because, for example, Poland has many of those advisory bodies. You, for example, have Demographic Council, and it has been set up 20 years ago. No one has ever heard anything concrete in particular from this body, and I'm sure it's very well staffed, the best Polish academicians working in the field of demography, but it's up to politicians to actually treat those bodies seriously and take their advice. And by taking this advice, I mean that there has to be a very strong political backing at the top of the government in the form of prime minister or the deputy prime minister, the guy who's heading the economy department, and actually translate it into legislative proposals. Without this, it's just another forum for discussions.
Sense of good, a series of good ideas. But do we have that with this Council of the Future?
Well, they only formed it today and announced people who are in it just today, so we haven't heard anything about it. We knew that the government is going to announce something big today, but we didn't know that it's going to be the Council for the Future.
Right.
So it's just a question of a couple of months. Is this body going to have like a timetable of meetings? Does the Prime Minister require them to submit proposals in some concrete schedules, right? Are they going to have a secretariat or some form of administrative environment in which they can actually put those proposals into paper? We don't know that. We don't know anything about the setup of this council.
Right.
And this is very important for it to work inside the government, because the governments are usually process people. They like processes. So there has to be a process set up for this idea actually to work. And I'm kind of worried that, for example, there is no banking guys on this council. Because among many things that Poland has to deal with when it comes to challenges it faces is the lack of the capital for startups. So there are startup people on this council, but not enough people knowing how to finance those startups, right? So
how to fund. So the council comes up with these great ideas to set up businesses in, let's say, AI, but then it hits a roadblock because it can't find the money.
Yeah, that's basically one of the problems that young Polish companies are facing. They cannot get enough money from local investors. And many Polish startups just go to the US to seek the funding because it's just easier, like the ecosystem of funding the companies, of looking for money, venture capital, private equity, it's just larger. And those people are used to taking big risks and huge gambles because they know how to diversify their investments. So if one of the investments fail, they can make this loss over with another investment. But that's the US, that's not Poland. Like Poland is a relatively freshly minted economy when it comes to the normal economy, not the communist one we had before 1989. So our ecosystem is not as developed as the US one. So this is one of the matters the council should focus on and see whether there are any obvious solutions.
Right, now that's an interesting point there, Kuba, because what we're actually talking about is for this to be effective, we need a far bigger ecosystem, to use your phrase. Do you believe this is part of the government's strategy? In other words, to get Poland to actually flex its economic muscle, not only within the country, but within Europe and further afield?
Well, of course, we've heard the economy minister saying that we have great companies in the space sector and we should leverage this know-how to build even greater and better economy. And it's kind of true of what he said. We have very good space companies. But what's crucial is the question of scale. Like, these are very small companies, and they only very recently started getting government contracts. Government contracts are good for small companies because they allow them to scale. In other words, you get one big customer, one customer that it's going to pay you the money, right? So it's a dependable customer.
Right.
The state is a dependable customer. Only very recently they started getting government contracts. So they are entering from a seed phase, from a very small company phase, they are entering the middle enterprise phase. So we don't have enough Airbuses. In other words, Airbuses, Lockheed Martins, Northrop Grumman's, whatever of the world.
Right.
So those companies need to be scaled up. And I'm not sure there's an easy way to do that.
I want to move on to our next topic, but before we do, very quickly, if you would, it sounds as though here's an opportunity for foreign investment to come into Poland. What do you think? What do you think is the likelihood of that happening?
Well, we are getting a lot of foreign investment, but the question is, what kind of investments are you getting? Of course, we had companies from all over the world setting shop in Poland and building manufacturing plants and so on. What we would really like them to do is to set up their research and development centers. And it has been happening to some extent. Finance Minister mentioned that we have excellent human capital. And it's true. However, this human capital, without this finance ecosystem, it doesn't really translate into big, strong companies. When we talk about investment, I would just like very quickly compare just two numbers. Like the capital investment figure for Poland is around 700 billion zlotys. So this is the amount of money that is being spent in Poland on investment. This is both private and public investment. 700 billion zlotys, that's around $220 billion. So this is a figure in a ballpark of what Google itself, one company, one US company, is going to spend on capital expenditure this year. So you see, in other words, what are we trying to do? Like Google alone is spending so much on capital investment as Poland itself. So we need to think about the scales in which we are, about which we are talking about.
We need to balance things out.
So we are still on this stage of economic development. We are trying to build big economic entities that can compete in a globalized marketplace, but we are not at the stage where they are big enough to just compete on themselves. They've entered the right path, but it's still a path, right?
Yes, well, it's interesting because actually that leads us on to the other area I want to talk about, which is a speech or an interview by President Macron, with President Macron with the FT. And there he talks about raising money through Eurobonds. Let's listen to a little bit of what he actually said in his interview.
We have the Chinese tsunami on the trade front and we have minute-by-minute instability on the American side. These two crises amount to a profound shock, a rupture for Europeans. My point was to say that when there is some relief after a crisis peaks, you shouldn't just let your guard down thinking it's over for good. That isn't true, because there is permanent instability now.
Okay, so it sounds as though what President Macron is saying is, hey, hang on, listen, we're facing threats on both sides. Economically, Europe, you need to wake up and start behaving like a global power. One of the things he talked about was raising money through Eurobonds. We'll come back to that, but your general perception of what he has just said?
I think Macron has been had the same message throughout his whole presidency. Like Europe needs to get its act together, see what instruments it has at hand and use those instruments, even if they are used in a very unorthodox way, some of those ways he proposed many, many times, to just leverage what we have and just make ourselves spring on a board of a global competitiveness, right? So in other words, do what the US and China are already doing. Because you have like very big economies which can leverage, for example, their internal markets to build very big companies which then successfully compete on a global stage. This is what's going on in the US, and it has been going on historically for many, many years now. And this is what is beginning to be done in China, which we see with batteries and rare earths, critical minerals, and so on. And Europe is not doing the same thing, because even though it is a single market, it is a very fragmented single market. So in other words, when you would try to like summarize what European countries by themselves are doing to face the challenges of the future, for example, how research in AI looks like. So it's like a Polish plan for AI, French plan for AI, German plan for AI, Spanish plan for AI, and on the top of them, there's going to be an European plan for the AI. So a very fragmented answer to one problem, complicated one, right? But still, in the US, you just have big companies doing investments. Their mission is very focused, get as much money, build as much infrastructure as possible, win the race, that's it.
Right.
Because winner takes it all.
Right.
And you have a very similar policy in China when the government just seeds money all over the place. Listen, guys, you need to do batteries. Let's see which one of those companies wins. And after like a decade or 2 decades, you just have a couple of national champions
Right.
being able to compete on a market. There's one policy, industrial policy for China, and one industrial policy for the US, but numerous industrial policies in Europe.
Is it different this time, do you think? I mean, you said Macron's been saying this for years now. Is this time any different? Have things happened in the geopolitical arena, which is kind of adding urgency to his message today?
Yeah, absolutely, and Macron mentioned them by himself. So Europe is being constantly kicked in the chin by the Trump administration, either with the Greenland case or with big tech regulation case. So we see that this alliance is not as firm and strong as it used to be, right? And this makes people in Europe kind of being worried about the future, whether US can weaponize some of the technologies we've been using peacefully for years now. What if they decide to turn our access to their cloud services off? No office in Europe will be working, right? Yesterday or today, Financial Times ran a piece about Europe looking to build their own payment solution, right? So instead of using MasterCard or Visa cards, just set up like a European shop for issuing cards and doing electronic payments. Because what if Washington, just in the near future, in some negotiation tries to pressure Europe into submission by saying, hey, we can turn off this access to Visa if you guys don't like it, right?
Right.
So from like 10 years ago, this was strictly political fiction stuff. But now people treat this threat seriously, right? And they are starting to think. Macron has been saying this all along, but of course, every solution of this kind needs investment, so there has to be money found for that, and the people in Europe were very unwilling to just spend extra money for that.
You say unwilling. I mean, Chancellor Merz is very sceptical. He's saying, well, France is only doing this to cover up for the fact that it's not investing enough in European affairs, for example, in defence, and it's going to end up with Germany footing the majority of the bill for it. I mean, does he have a point?
But in some sense he has, because France has always been using Europe for furthering its own foreign policy goals. But this has been true also for Germany. So the question is, and there is a considerable shift in Berlin also, because like the backbone of Merz's economic plan is actually ramping up capital investment in the country. So he also needs to tap new sources of funding, and this will be money he will borrow on the global market. That's it. There's no other place to invest it into bridges and railroads and new companies and AI and whatever and whatnot. So in other words, the conversation in Europe is shifting. It's just not shifting as fast as Macron would like it to be, or even as some experts in Europe would like. 2 years ago, we had a big Mario Draghi report about European competitiveness. A very concrete set of steps has been proposed inside of this very unwieldy 400 pages long document. And they haven't been translated into policy on European level, or only 10% of those prescriptions have been translated. So this shows you that the pace Europe sets itself in the discussions is much faster than the pace Europe sets itself inside of the legislative agenda.
Right.
So there's still much to be done.
Well, there is much to be done, and there's an informal meeting coming up on Thursday of this week. What do you expect to be on the agenda? Very quickly, if you would, please.
We know that competitiveness will be on the agenda, and it's not a sexy term, but it should be very, very sexy, because this is what Europe is sorely lacking, right? And Mario Draghi, which I mentioned earlier, is going to be in attendance, as well as Enrico Letta. So we have two former Italian prime ministers, and they both done reports on European competitiveness. So they will brief European leaders on where we are at this, trying to build up European competitiveness and what needs to be done else. And I think this meeting is totally devoted to finding a political compromise, because after that you will have an official European Council, and after that you will have a document which will set out the agenda for the rest of the year for the European Commission to implement. So all the ideas that are going to be discussed on Thursday will find their way eventually to what's going to be discussed and agreed upon on the March meeting, on the official European
And hopefully
Council.
a policy document which breaks down some of those barriers that are currently fragmenting Europe. Jakub Kapiszewski, thank you very much, as always, for sharing your
pleasure.
your analysis. That brings us to the end of this episode of News in Depth. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.